Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we'll focus on U.S. Special Operations with the help of our guest, Air Force Colonel Wolfe Davidson. Colonel Davidson is an Air Force Special Tactics officer who has spent the majority of his military career in special operations. He's currently a fellow at the Wilson Center. Wolfe, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let me ask you to describe your current position with the Air Force, commander of the 724th Special Tactics Group.
Right, that was my former position before I became a fellow. I was a commander of a Air Force Special Tactics Group, about 400 individuals that primarily organize, train, and equip for Special Operations Forces. Really focused on integrating air power into the ground Special Operations element. Something that we've seen over the last couple decades be an extremely powerful military tool is when you take this third dimension of air power and combine it with very elite Special Operations Forces on the ground. And certainly we've seen that on the news, has been highlighted in the early times in Iraq as well as in Afghanistan after 9/11.
Sounds like a huge job, 400 people, very complex missions.
It's an exceptional job because of the folks that you get to work with on a daily basis. You just get to handpick the best of the best, and there's nothing you can do to make a mission more successful than hire the right people to do that mission. And it's truly it's a great opportunity when you're in that position.
Well, you're being modest, I'm guessing, as well, because it's quite a management challenge as well.
Absolutely. There's no question that when you're responsible for operations across the globe, folks' lives are in danger on a nightly basis. Certainly a lot of stress associated with that across the organization. And the nation, when they're calling for help, they're calling for elite forces, and you have to make sure that each and every one of your folks is up to that task on a daily basis.
Describe your career track. I mean, somebody doesn't get involved in special operations as a starter job or as an entry-level job. How do you move in that direction?
Well, there are a couple organizations that you can come straight in as an opportunity.
Really?
Navy SEALs is a perfect example. Army Special Forces.
Well, but assuming you fit all the requirements, right?
That's exactly right. You go through a fairly elaborate selection process, which is what I had done. Early in my life, some things had happened that said, hey, I decided I'm interested in the special operations thing. I came in contact with a Special Forces soldier from Vietnam that said, hey, I think you would like this. And through that, I started researching and then started the application process. And it was about 2 years of training and selection before you finally make it into the job, but well worth it in the end. And what that selection offers is a very tight-knit group of individuals that all have something in common. They've all made it through a process that is rigorous, that is given them the credibility as well as the confidence that they're the right person for the jobs that we're going to put them in.
What percentage, or how could you break down the requirements as it relates to the mental requirements, the maybe emotional requirements versus the physical requirements?
Well, the physical requirements are the ones that are talked about the most. They tend to be the least selective in the long term, the most selective in the short term. So certainly if someone can't do enough sit-ups or pull-ups or run fast enough or swim fast enough, they're not going to make it through the first few weeks. But in the end, as you see over a career, as folks start to develop and be promoted, it really comes down to mental toughness associated with the hard challenges we have out there, resilience to be able to continue to take a beating and keep on coming back, and then of course the mental agility to be able to deal with whatever situation's out there. And it's that maturity that makes special operations so unique.
And what about the overlap between special forces and conventional forces or traditional forces? How much is there? Do you operate completely separately? Does it depend on the mission?
It certainly depends on the mission, but it has absolutely grown. In fact, Admiral McCraven, the commander of the United States Special Operations Command, has added a truth, what we call Special Operations Forces truths, things that are going to remain true, and that is that we are reliant on conventional forces. And it is clearly the case as we've seen over the last 10 years or 12 years of constant combat. We are absolutely interdependent with the conventional forces for things such as airlift, air support, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, just staging bases, having chow halls and things like that at staging bases. We absolutely rely on conventional forces, so we're independent.
What are the challenges in integrating the two?
Typically it's communication and just breaking down. It's getting the truth out there and understanding one another. I would say that is the main issue is communication and trust. Admiral McCraven and Special Operations and General McChrystal before him were a huge believer that trust is the most important thing that we can build out there. So trust in your relationships that you create with one another. So it takes some time with new leaders to do that, but over time, when everybody is focused on the mission and they're all trying to do the right things, really it's just misunderstandings that cause the problems.
Are there rivalries or or even resentments? You're the special guys. Anything like that you encounter?
Certainly there are from time to time, and again they tend to go away once people understand each other.
Yeah, and speaking of how we understand Special Forces, you see, have you seen Zero Dark 30, for example?
I have not seen them.
You have not seen it? Okay, well then I'm at a disadvantage in asking you if you think it's accurate or not. But beyond that, popular culture depictions of what it is to be a Navy SEAL or to be in any elite force, how accurate is it?
Well, I think they've gone a long way of asking folks who have been there. That has kind of brought a lot of truth to some of the movies that are out there. It's certainly dramatized far beyond the reality of where we are today. In the end, and one of the things I think that causes that is that when they seek folks to talk to about what it's like, those tend to be folks that are outliers in general. They are folks
who are
who
willing to talk about things that maybe you shouldn't talk about.
In some special operators' minds, they're willing to compromise their trust with their brothers in special operations for their own good, whether it's for their own good or not. Sometimes clearly they want more recognition for the force, which is helpful in things like budget debates and others, or jobs after they get out. So certainly it's easier to find a job as a Navy if you have the stigma as a Navy SEAL versus, hey, I was a welder in the Navy or something along those lines. So it's certainly an aspect, but I would say in the end it's very difficult. Every organization is different. Having elite organizations, groups create group dynamics that are different amongst them. So it's difficult to kind of characterize this mythical culture of a special operations team that the movies attempt to do.
So among you and your colleagues, your brothers in arms, brothers and sisters in arms, is something like Zero Dark 30 viewed as a betrayal of trust? Because people are consultants to it, and a book is written that describes the raid that brought Osama bin Laden to justice. How is it viewed from the inside looking out?
It is typically looked at as a betrayal. That is certainly the case, and for no other concern than for the safety and the success of future missions. So the safety of the folks who are executing and the success of future missions, regardless of how much you don't want to put information out there that's relevant. Each time a book is written, more and more information comes out there that's absolutely relevant.
Of what the MO is and how you approach a mission.
Absolutely. So it is of that concern.
Yeah. And give us some sense, Wolfe, of the range of types of missions that Special Forces can be involved in.
Well, I think there's really two main groups that are most characterized in that. Certainly since terrorism has kind of taken a spotlight of foreign policy here over the last 15 years or so. But there's an indirect approach to special operations. This is the stuff that President Kennedy had highlighted during his time, working by, with, and through partner nations and partner forces to achieve a greater capability than just the U.S. capability alone. And that we call that the indirect approach. And then that's typically special forces. The Army Special Forces are our primary force that's focused on that. And then there's what we call a direct approach, which is the typical counterterrorism mission like Zero Dark 30 depicts, where you're actually conducting, counterterrorism missions or raids to capture, individuals or nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or any of those types of things that are out there. So it's really these two things that sometimes come in contrast to one another, because in the overall accomplishment of the mission, sometimes they go counter to one another, and it's really the strategist that has to lay those out so that you can achieve kind of compiled success towards the overall objectives that the civilian leadership of the country has laid out.
In the New World Order that came about in reaction to 9/11, certainly not the Cold War paradigm, are Special Forces growing both in size and importance?
Since 9/11, Special Operations has grown quite a bit, fairly significantly, and its tasks in terms of that has gone up even more so. It's still a very small percentage of overall defense. I mean, a very, very small percentage.
Could you say exact quantify? Are we talking less than 10% or less
right.
than 1%?
There's about 60,000 in Special Operations Command. That includes all of the support and personnel and all those folks, not operators, if you will. But about 60,000 total. And if you think of an active duty military, and I think we're still in the range of 1.2 million kind of folks, that's a fairly small number in terms of the investment. In terms of cost investment, it's a small number, I believe. It's less than 1% of the overall defense budget goes to special operations. So fairly high return on investment associated with those. When you look at the flexibility they provide to the civilian leadership in terms of the problems that the nation falls out there. And you'd asked about this transition on 9/11, and certainly those in the counterterrorism business knew who Osama bin Laden and had been tracking him for a long time. And throughout the 90s, Al-Qaeda was attacking us across the globe. I think what was kind of illustrated on 9/11 was the empowerment that an individual and a group can make in today's society with the technological innovation that continues to grow that's out there. And regardless of what that individual or that group's desire is, whether it's politically or idealistically or financially, which I think we saw that well before 9/11, that an individual, a hyper-empowered individual, can financially change the world. Well, that's certainly the case for one that is attempting to do so militarily or in another mechanism. So what I think we saw changed on 9/11 really was that our defense posture had to account for individuals and groups. Because once the genie's out of the bottle, it's not going back in, and that's what we're going to face for the future. So I think our military is going to rely on forces like Special Operations to do those kind of things.
I see that you were a part of Project Checkmate and the Strategic Studies Group. Could you tell us what that is?
Sure. That was on the Air Staff, working for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And you have a small group of folks that are primarily trying to advise the Chief of Staff and provide information with regards to the strategic nature of the future.
Things you were just describing, the changing landscape.
Exactly. And so you have a myriad of different specialties. I was the guy focused on Special Operations to say, hey, this is how the impact of the future environment could have on Special Operations. For the chiefs, the Chief of Staff has two roles: run the Air Force, and the other one is to provide military advice to the President. And we kind of support that second one more than the first one.
Could you give us some insight into the types of recommendations that emerge from an exercise like that?
Certainly. I think one of the things that I did was, when I was on Checkmate, was work on an irregular warfare strategy. In essence, it was, how do we take the Air Force assets that are out there and better apply those assets to the challenges that irregular warfare, or counterterrorism, or counterinsurgency, and those things that are out of the traditional warfare realm? How do we apply air power better to those types of environments? Because unfortunately, we don't have the resources to just build airplanes for specific missions. They're very costly. So we have to find ways to use the resources we have across the whole spectrum of conflict that's out there. A lot of our time is spent on doing that. How do we, at the lower levels, are trying to find good tactics and techniques that can do it, and airmen are very, very good at that. They have been throughout history. However, procedurally through the institution, sometimes there are many roadblocks to being able to do that, and there's decisions that have to be made. So if a pilot's going to find a lot of time becoming very proficient at dropping bombs in a very close combined fight like we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq, then something else is going to have to give way. And those are the decisions that you have to advise the chief on how do we ensure that we're not mortgaging national security for the sake of a specific mission that we've been asked to do. And that's kind of what the highlight of the mission was.
One of the criticisms, I'm sure you've heard it, not just of the U.S. military, of military forces throughout history, is that there's a tendency to fight the last war. And along the lines of the things you've been talking about, how confident are you that we're moving forward in a way that addresses the current environment?
Well, I think the challenge with that is that the last war was real and the next one is still perceived at this point. So it's very difficult, and there's so many opinions on what the next conflict's going to entail. That makes it challenging. So I would say that a big institution like the military, we do tend to look at the last war to ensure, and we learn those lessons. But there's also this aspect that the institution has a culture, and they will tend to gravitate back to that culture at some point. The Army has been criticized for not being very reactive to a counterinsurgency operation. And then at the same time, I hear recent criticism that the Army is completely adopted this counterinsurgency. And the answer is, if you're a commander who's out fighting an insurgency, you're going to become an expert on counterinsurgency, because that's what you have to do to keep your soldiers alive and to win and succeed in the mission that you've been given. That doesn't mean that you believe counterinsurgency is the way of the future. And I think sometimes the political debate attempts to put more, they seek those who maybe look out for what they value, and sometimes they put folks in the wrong job jars, in my opinion.
Yeah, you know, the whole rapidly changing environment we live in, both in the civilian world and the military world. What can you say about how the military is adapting to some recent changes? The end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the decision that women can now serve in the front lines. How is the military reacting to these types of changes?
Well, I think
I'm not talking about the men and women in uniform.
Absolutely, I think the military is very adaptive. And in fact, I think that's why you hear so little about those decisions once they're made. The military is in essence a compliant organization. They've been a social experiment over the years for things like this, and I think it's fairly adaptive. I think,
and a meritocracy.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, absolutely.
A lot of things aren't in life. The military,
and there's no question. And when you deviate from a meritocracy in military organizations, it is devastating to morale. Folks very much can understand if they're not the best person for the job, and they appreciate that, and they want to be told that. But they struggle with if there is anything other than that type of selection process for where they are, and we struggle with that when you merge military and civilian workforces, because they have two different promotion systems, and a lot of former military folks in the civil service, and there's sometimes this conflict. And I've experienced conflict in those processes and how they kind of come together. But if you look at something like, you know, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or the integration of women into combat roles, something the Air Force took on, you know, a decade plus ago. So it wasn't new, of course, for the Air Force. I think the most important thing is kind of the sense of identity that the military has. And it was kind of like the guidance that I gave my force when the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I was in command when that policy changed. And it was as simple as this. It's like, hey, you know, it's all about respect for one another and what they can offer to the mission. You don't have to like someone. You don't even have to respect what they offer if they're not good at what they do. And if you're a person that happens to be, you know, gay or bisexual, then don't represent yourself as a gay or bisexual. Represent yourself as a professional airman who's very good at your job, and people will respect you. All right? Hey, I'm an airman, and I can make this mission better. People respect that. If you try to define yourself as something else, and it doesn't matter if it's regardless of what those things are, then you are misidentifying with your brothers and sisters in arms, and you're therefore going to struggle with respect from your peers.
One final question, and about 10 seconds to answer it, but I would just like to know, what's the most valuable thing you're going to take away from your experience here at the Wilson Center?
I think it's gaining a perspective from the huge plethora of folks that come here from academic institutions and from public policy scholars from across the globe. There's really a tremendous amount that's offered to a military officer that I can take back to the Air Force and to special operations for my future opportunities.
Colonel Wolfe Davidson, thank you for joining us.
Sir. Thank you.
After the break, we'll get the latest on attempts to negotiate with Iran over its nuclear program. We'll be right back.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
Welcome back. Michael Adler is a journalist and a Wilson Center public policy scholar. He's been covering nuclear issues and Iran's nuclear program in particular for many years, and joins us to discuss the latest round of negotiations. And we should be clear to our viewers and listeners, we're having this discussion prior to the beginning of this next round of negotiations. So in other words, don't hold our predictions against us, right?
Absolutely.
Let me ask you this, Michael. This whole notion of Iran approaching breakout capability, what does that mean? What would
a breakout capability would be the ability to, in short order and secretly, to make enough fissile material to make a nuclear weapon. They're not there yet. There was the concern, especially on the part of Israel, that they would be there in mid-2013. But now I think the predictions are tending more towards mid-2014.
Yeah, is this based on this Israeli intelligence that is now saying 2015?
And then the Israelis said 2015, but I think
Yeah.
the Israeli intelligence was that they could actually make a nuclear weapon. You have to make the fissile material. That's the toughest part. That for the Iranians is enriching uranium. Then you have to turn it into a weapon. And then the third stage is making the weapon small enough to fit on top of a missile. The Iranians are a ways away from that.
Before we talk about this next round of negotiations, let's look back to the previous round of negotiations. Did anything happen that was significant, or was that just a continue of the stall tactic?
What happened that was significant was that there was a good dialogue between the two sides. They spoke well to each other. The Iranians focused on the nuclear issue. They talked business. What was not good was that the two sides just spoke at each other. There was no point at which they said, hey, my position is this, your position is that, let's get in between to make a compromise. It was very much the Iranians saying, you should recognize our right to enrich, and the P5+1, the United States and its negotiating allies, saying you must stop enriching 20% enriched uranium, which is closer to weapon grade, and then we'll begin the real discussion.
Does the new projection on when this so-called breakout capability will occur, does this change things significantly, or does it just broaden the timeline of how much time there is for all sides to come together?
Well, it does both, because the timeline being broadened is a significant change. If the Iranians were to break out tomorrow, it'd be a different situation where you think you have a year or two for negotiations still to do.
And what's looming in the background of my questions is this notion of a military response. So does this take the sort of the itchy trigger finger is scratched for now because it's not 2013, it's 2015?
The trigger finger has been put down since March of last year, when Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, accepted that diplomacy would have the priority for now. Mm-hmm. And it was not mentioned much in the Israeli elections that were just held. And the Israelis are not making noises saying, this must happen or we're attacking. So it is in the background, but it is in the background.
When the Israelis or the Americans say it's unacceptable to have a nuclear-armed Iran, is this negotiating rhetoric, or is this a true bright line that they will not allow Iran to cross?
There is debate on that, but President Obama has said very clearly that the United States will prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. He has not said it's unacceptable, because something could be unacceptable to me and yet it takes place. Mm-hmm. He has said we will prevent them.
In other words, that's a threat, not thinly veiled. That's a threat that we will not allow this to happen.
Absolutely.
And so tell us what we can expect with all of these factors in place as we head to another round of negotiations. In other words, the expectations game. I don't think, and this is my guess and I'm not the expert, that anything we say today is going to be preempted before this discussion airs by some dramatic announcement on the 26th or 27th.
Well, the situation is, one, that the timeline for them getting fissile material, enough fissile material to make a weapon, we seem to be comfortable that it's going to be later than we thought. That gives time for diplomacy. The other reason that supports what you're saying is that the two sides have irreconcilable positions at this point. Iran wants, in the first step of diplomacy, for sanctions against it to be lifted, sanctions which are crippling its economy and hurting its oil exports. And the United States says, we want you to show in an act of good faith, in a confidence-building measure, to step down from this advanced enriching of uranium, and then we'll talk about the overall problem of your enriching at all and our concerns about its being directed to make a weapon.
Mm-hmm. And so what will it take, Michael? You've been covering this story for a long time. How long now have you been following this story?
Since 2002.
Yeah. And what will it take for a breakthrough? Is there a breakthrough in your imagination that is conceivable?
I think, surprisingly, the people in the U.S. administration feel that if they sit down with the Iranians and begin to talk and can pass on messages, that there could be a 6-month negotiating process which might bear fruit. The key...
So why hasn't that happened?
Well,
the Ayatollah rejected the latest overture?
Absolutely. Vice President Biden in Germany early this month said the United States is ready for bilateral talks. And soon after that, the supreme leader of Iran said, we don't want bilateral talks with the United States. And what he said was, you are holding a gun to our head with sanctions. and yet you say you want to talk. Iran does not negotiate that way. So what will take, what we need for a breakthrough is for the two sides to sit down together in a forum where they can have informal discussions. And at some point, for the American side to say, we really want a settlement, and we might be willing, don't worry, there's an end game where you can keep some enrichment. At that point, the Iranians, if they decide to trust us, will say, okay, and we're willing to work towards it this way, but this must take place first. You've got to show that you respect our sovereignty, our right to enrich, and you've got to lift more sanctions. But that's a discussion that has to take place to some degree on the margins of diplomacy, because right now there is a gulf between the two sides and a lack of trust since 1979 in the Islamic Resolution, and a lack of communication, which make real diplomacy impossible.
Would a best case scenario from the upcoming talks next week, would that be that there will be more talks? Would that be the best case scenario?
That's such a scary statement, because that's always been the best case scenario. And since 2003, the process limps on and on and on and on. But definitely it will be, I think, and I could be wrong, in future talks, in the second, third, fourth round, that we'll start seeing a breakthrough take place.
Forgive me for asking you to speculate, because I know you'd rather report on what you know. But is Iran determined to join the nuclear club, and they are going to move forward no matter what? Or do you see possibilities for a deal?
Well, I think Iran gets its objectives accomplished by developing the capacity. It's called a hedge, so that they could be able to make a weapon.
They don't build the bomb, but we all know they could if they wanted to.
They start amassing enough fissile material to break out, but they don't break out. They are amassing technical abilities all the time, and they never build the bomb, but we know they could. That might have the same strategic effect for them as actually having the bomb would. And it would forestall any U.S. attack.
A quick final thought, Iranian politics, internal politics, a new president will be selected in June. Is this a factor?
I don't think so. I don't think that, certainly when Ahmadinejad came to office in 2005, it changed the tenor of what was taking place. But the Iranians who were suspending enrichment of uranium at that time were already moving towards ending the suspension. So I think when you talk of nuclear politics, that would not be affected by a new president.
Well, Michael, thank you, and we will be inviting you back if there is a breakthrough to talk about that as well.
My pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thanks. That's all for this edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. I want to thank you for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.